This video will review solving inequalities covered in Chapter 3, Section 5. The first problem we're going to look at, they ask us to use the figure to solve the inequalities. So we have two parts to this inequality. Part A, they want to know where the graph is less than 0. And then part B, they want to know where the graph is greater than or equal to 0. So we start with part A. We want to know where the graph is less than 0. If it's less than 0, then we're really focusing on where the graph is below the x-axis. The answers that we want to give, we want to focus on the x values. So by doing that, we want to look at intervals on the x-axis that are broken up by the x-intercepts. So we have two x-intercepts in this graph. We have -1 as an x-intercept and 4 as an x-intercept. So whenever we have two intercepts, we're going to have three intervals in the graph. So the intervals are from -∞ to -1. And remember, we're only looking, I don't know why that keeps happening. Okay, let's try this. We're only looking at the x values, so the y values just tell what we'll talk about in a second. So we're only looking at the x-axis to determine these intervals. So the next interval is from -1 to 4. And then our last interval is from 4 to infinity. So really that first interval is saying any value less than -1. That second interval is saying any value between -1 and 4. And then the last interval is saying any value greater than 4. In part A, we're specifically looking at where the graph, or the blue line, is below the x-axis, or less than 0. So we're going to look at these three intervals and determine if the graph is below the x-axis. So from -∞ to -1, again, that's this interval right here, we notice that the graph is below the x-axis. I mean, yes, this graph will continue on and on forever, but it eventually will get to -4, just way down here, as opposed to actually located in the graph. So for part A, one interval we know that is true is -∞ to -1. The question is, do we put a bracket or parenthesis on the -1? Remember, we're strictly dealing with less than values. If we're strictly dealing with less than values, that means the value is not included, and if it's not included, you get a parenthesis. Remember, if the value is included, then you get a bracket. And just a nice little reminder, anytime you put infinity, always gets a parenthesis, because that is not specifically a number, it's just saying any value. Just because we will have one interval doesn't mean we won't have more than one interval, so I'm going to look at the other three intervals, or the other two intervals. So the next interval is from -1 to 4. We want to look at where the graph is in that interval. The graph is above the x-axis, which is not what part A is asking us to do. Part A is asking us to look at less than 0 or below the x-axis. And then 4 to infinity, again, we're focusing on just all the values greater than 4. That is below the x-axis, the graph, which is less than 0, so that is another interval that works here. 4 to infinity, and remember, infinity always gets a parenthesis on it. And then we have to think to ourselves, is 4 included? It is not included because, again, we're strictly dealing with a less than here. We're not dealing with a less than or equal. So we put a parenthesis on the 4. So we have two intervals that satisfy this inequality. Typically, whenever you have two intervals satisfying an inequality, you want to put the little union symbol. That just means that both of these are true. And it's not a U. It looks like a U, but it is a union symbol. Please make sure you use your math palette there to get the union symbol, not just the U. Don't use the letter U. So there's our answer for part A. The graph is less than 0 on the intervals negative infinity to negative 1, not included, and 4 not included to infinity. So part B, we need to determine where the graph is greater than or equal to 0. Remember, we're only looking at these 3 intervals, and if it's greater than or equal to 0, that means it's above the x-axis. We already have the first and the third interval being below the x-axis, so it can't be both above and below. So we need to check that interval negative 1 to 4. I will mention sometimes it's right on the x-axis, so don't always think that if that interval that we didn't choose for one is going to be the answer for the other. So from negative 1 to 4, is the graph greater than or equal to 0 or above the x-axis? Yes, it is. So we have negative 1 to 4 as our interval, but we need to determine, are we going to put brackets or parentheses on our interval? Because it's a greater than or equal to, we want the ending points or the x-intercepts to be included. So because they're included, we put brackets. So for part B, where the graph is greater than or equal to 0 is on the interval negative 1 included to 4 included.